The Manson family, known among its members simply as the family, was a commune, gang, and cult led by criminal Charles Manson that operated in California during the late 1960s and early 1970s. At its peak, the group consisted of approximately 40 followers who lived an unconventional lifestyle, frequently using psychoactive drugs including amphetamines and hallucinogens such as LSD. Most members were young women from middle-class backgrounds, many initially attracted by hippie counterculture and communal living before being radicalized by Manson's teachings. The group murdered at least 9 people and may have killed as many as 24. Manson had been institutionalized or incarcerated for more than half his life by the time he was released from prison in 1967. He began attracting followers in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they gradually moved to a rundown movie ranch called Spawn Ranch in Los Angeles County. According to group member Susan Atkins, members of the family became convinced that Manson was a manifestation of Jesus Christ and believed in his prophecies concerning an imminent apocalyptic race war. In 1969, Manson family members Atkins, Charles Denton Tex, Watson, and Patricia Krenwinkel entered the home of actress Sharon Tate and murdered her along with 4 others. Linda Kasabian was also present but did not participate in the killings. The following night, family members murdered supermarket executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary at their Los Angeles home. Members also committed numerous assaults, petty crimes, theft, and acts of vandalism, including an assassination attempt on U.S. President Gerald Ford in 1975 by family member Lynette Squeaky Fromm. Following his release from prison on March 22, 1967, Charles Manson moved to San Francisco, where, with help from a prison acquaintance, he settled into an apartment in Berkeley. In prison, bank robber Alvin Karpus had taught Manson to play steel guitar. Living mostly by panhandling, Manson soon became acquainted with Mary Brunner, a 23-year-old University of Wisconsin graduate working as a library assistant at UC Berkeley. He moved in with her, and according to second-hand accounts, Manson overcame Brunner's resistance to bringing other women into their living arrangement. Before long, the pair were sharing Brunner's residence with 18 other women. Manson established himself as a guru in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, which during 1967's Summer of Love was emerging as the iconic hippie locale. He may have borrowed elements of his philosophy from the Process Church of the Final Judgment, whose members believed Satan would become reconciled to Jesus, and together they would judge humanity at the world's end. Manson soon gathered his first group of followers, mostly female, who were later dubbed the Manson family by Los Angeles prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi and the media. Manson allegedly taught his followers they were reincarnations of the original Christians, while the establishment represented the Romans. Around 1967, he began using the alias Charles Willis Manson. Before summer's end, Manson and some followers began traveling in an old school bus they had converted, replacing many seats with colored rugs and pillows. They eventually settled in Los Angeles areas, including Topanga Canyon, Malibu, and Venice. In 1967, Brunner became pregnant by Manson. On April 15, 1968, she gave birth to their son, whom she named Valentine Michael, in a condemned Topanga Canyon house where they were living. Several young women from the family assisted with the delivery. Like most group members, Brunner acquired numerous aliases and nicknames including Marioshe, OK, Mother Mary, Mary Manson, Linda D. Manson, and Christine Marie-Aux. Actor Al Lewis had Manson babysit his children occasionally and described him as a nice guy when I knew him. Music producer Phil Kaufman introduced Manson to Universal Studios producer Gary Stromberg, who was then working on a film adaptation of Jesus' life set in modern America, featuring a black Jesus and southern redneck Romans. Stromberg found that Manson made interesting suggestions about what Jesus might do in various situations, seeming naturally attuned to the role. Manson had one of his women kiss his feet, then kissed hers in return to demonstrate women's place in his worldview. At the beach one day, Stromberg watched as Manson preached against materialism. When a listener questioned him about their well-furnished bus, Manson tossed the keys to the doubter, who promptly drove away with the vehicle while Manson watched, apparently unconcerned. According to Stromberg, Manson possessed a dynamic personality and could read people's emotional weaknesses to manipulate them. For example, Manson attempted to manipulate Danny DiCarlo, treasurer of the Straight Satan's Motorcycle Club, by granting him access to family women. He convinced DiCarlo that his large penis helped keep the women loyal to the group. Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys picked up Patricia Krenwinkel and Ella Jo Bailey while they were hitchhiking in late spring 1968, while he was under the influence of alcohol and LSD. Wilson brought them to his Pacific Palisades house for several hours. The following morning, returning home from a night recording session, he was greeted in his driveway by Manson, who emerged from Wilson's house. When Wilson asked the stranger if he intended harm, Manson assured him he meant no harm and began kissing Wilson's feet. Inside the house, Wilson discovered 12 strangers, mostly women. According to the account in Manson in his own words, Manson first met Wilson at a friend's San Francisco house where Manson had gone to obtain marijuana. Manson claimed Wilson gave him his Sunset Boulevard address and invited him to visit in Los Angeles. Wilson stated in a 1968 Record Mirror article that when he mentioned the Beach Boys' involvement with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi to a group of strange women, they told me they too had a guru, a guy named Charlie. Over the following months, the number of women in Wilson's house doubled. He covered their expenses, which amounted to approximately $21,000, including destruction of his uninsured car, which they had borrowed. Wilson would sing and talk with Manson, and both men treated the women as servants. Wilson paid for studio time to record Manson's songs and introduced him to entertainment industry contacts, including Greg Jacobson, Terry Melcher, and Rudy Altobelli. Altobelli owned a house he rented to actress Sharon Tate and her husband, director Roman Polanski. Jacobson was impressed by the whole Charlie Manson package, as artist, lifestyle guru, and philosopher, and paid to record Manson's material. When Wilson's lease expired, he moved out and his landlord evicted the family. Manson established a base for the family at Spahn Ranch in August 1968, after Wilson's landlord evicted them. The ranch had served as a television and movie set for westerns, but the buildings had deteriorated by the time the family arrived. By the late 1960s, the ranch derived revenue primarily from horseback rides. Female family members performed chores around the ranch and occasionally had sex with the ranch's nearly blind 80-year-old owner, George Spahn, on Manson's orders. The women also served as guides for him. In exchange, Spahn allowed Manson's group to live at the ranch free of charge. Lynette Fromme acquired the nickname Squeaky because she often squeaked when Spahn pinched her thigh. Charles Watson, a small-town Texan who had quit college and moved to California, soon joined the group at the ranch. On March 23, 1969, Manson entered the grounds of 1050 Cielo Drive, which he had known as Melcher's residence. He was uninvited. As he approached the main house, Manson encountered Shahrukh Hatami, an Iranian photographer who had befriended Polanski and Tate during production of the documentary Mia and Roman. Hatami was there to photograph Tate before her departure for Rome the next day. Seeing Manson approach, Hatami went onto the front porch to ask what he wanted. Manson said he was looking for someone whose name Hatami didn't recognize. Hatami told him this was the Polanski residence and advised Manson to try the back alley, meaning the path to the guest house behind the main house. Concerned about the stranger, Hatami walked down the front path to confront Manson. Tate appeared behind Hatami in the front doorway and asked who was calling. Hatami explained that a man was looking for someone. He and Tate maintained their positions, while Manson walked to the guest house without speaking, returned to the front a minute or two later, and left. That evening, Manson returned to the property and again went to the guest house. He entered the enclosed porch and spoke with Altobelli, the owner, who had just emerged from the shower. Manson asked for Melcher, but Altobelli sensed that Manson was actually looking for him. It was later discovered that Manson had apparently visited the property on earlier occasions after Melcher moved away. Altobelli told Manson through the screen door that Melcher had moved to Malibu and claimed not to know his new address, though he actually did. Altobelli mentioned he was in the entertainment business and had met Manson the previous year at Wilson's home, which he was certain Manson already knew. At that meeting, he had offered limited praise for some of Manson's musical recordings that Wilson had been playing. Altobelli told Manson he was leaving the country the next day, and Manson expressed interest in speaking with him upon his return. Altobelli said he would be gone for more than a year. Manson claimed he had been directed to the guest house by people in the main house. Altobelli asked Manson not to disturb his tenants. Altobelli and Tate flew together to Rome the next day. Tate asked him whether that creepy-looking guy had visited him at the guest house the day before. Tex Watson became involved in drug dealing and robbed a dealer named Bernard Lotzapapa Crow. Crow allegedly responded with threats to kill everyone at Spawn Ranch. In response, Charles Manson shot Crow on July 1, 1969, at Manson's Hollywood apartment. Manson's belief that he had killed Crow seemed confirmed by a news report about the discovery of a Black Panther's body in Los Angeles. Although Crow was not a Black Panther member, Manson concluded he had been and expected retaliation from the Panthers. He transformed Spawn Ranch into a defensive camp, establishing armed night patrols. Watson would later write, "Blackie was trying to get at the chosen ones." Manson brought in members of the Straight Satan's Motorcycle Club to provide security. During this period, Bobby Beausoleil became more deeply involved with the family. Gary Allen Hinman, born December 24, 1934 in Colorado, was a music teacher and UCLA PhD student. At some point in the late 1960s, he befriended members of the Manson family, occasionally allowing some to stay at his home. According to various sources, including family member Susan Atkins, Manson believed Hinman was wealthy. He sent family members Bobby Beausoleil, Mary Brunner, and Atkins to Hinman's home on July 25, 1969, to convince him to join the family and surrender assets Manson thought Hinman had inherited. The three held Hinman hostage for 2 days, as he denied having any money. During this time, Manson arrived with a sword and slashed Hinman's face and ear. Afterward, Beausoleil stabbed Hinman to death, allegedly following Manson's instructions. Before leaving the Topanga Canyon residence, Beausoleil or one of the women used Hinman's blood to write "Political Piggy" on the wall and drew a panther paw, a Black Panther symbol. According to Manson and Beausoleil in magazine interviews from 1981 and 1998-99, Beausoleil said he went to Hinman's to recover money paid for mescaline provided to the Straight Satans that had allegedly been defective. Beausoleil added that Brunner and Atkins, unaware of his true intent, accompanied him to visit Hinman. In her 1977 autobiography, Atkins wrote that Manson directed Beausoleil, Brunner, and her to go to Hinman's and obtain the supposed $21,000 inheritance. She said that 2 days earlier, Manson had told her privately that if she wanted to do something important, she could kill Hinman and take his money. Beausoleil was arrested on August 6, 1969, after being caught driving Hinman's car. Police found the murder weapon in the tire well. On the night of August 8, 1969, Manson directed Tex Watson to take Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel to Melcher's former home at 150 Cielo Drive in Los Angeles. According to Watson, Manson told them to kill everyone there. The home had recently been rented to actress Sharon Tate and her husband, director Roman Polanski, who was away in Europe working on The Day of the Dolphin. Manson told the three women to follow Watson's orders. The family members killed the 5 people they found: Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant and living there at the time, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojciech Frykowski, who were visiting her, and Stephen Parent, who had been visiting the caretaker. Atkins wrote "Pig" with Tate's blood on the front door as they departed. The murders created a nationwide sensation. The night of August 9, 1969, 7 family members, Leslie Van Houten, Steve Clem, Grogan, Charles Manson, and the 4 from the previous night, drove to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Watson said that after going there alone, Manson returned to bring him to the house. After Manson pointed through a window to a man sleeping in the living room, the 2 men entered through an unlocked back door. Watson bound the couple and covered their heads with pillowcases. Manson left, sending Krenwinkel and Van Houten into the house. Watson directed the women to the bedroom where Rosemary had been bound. He began stabbing Leno with a bayonet in the living room. Going to the bedroom, Watson discovered Rosemary swinging a lamp at the family women. He stabbed her with the bayonet, then returned to the living room to continue attacking Leno, stabbing him multiple times. Krenwinkel also stabbed Rosemary. Watson instructed Van Houten to stab the woman as well, which she did. Krenwinkel used the LaBianca's blood to write "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the walls, and "Helter Skelter" on the refrigerator door. Meanwhile, Manson directed Kasabian to drive to an acquaintance's home. Manson dropped off Kasabian, Grogan, and Atkins, then drove back to Spawn Ranch. Kasabian allegedly thwarted another murder by deliberately knocking on the wrong door. In a 1971 trial following his Tate LaBianca convictions, Manson was found guilty of murdering Gary Hinman and Donald "Shorty" Shea, receiving a life sentence. Shea was a Spawn Ranch stuntman and horse wrangler, killed approximately 10 days after a sheriff's raid on the ranch in August 1969. Manson, who suspected Shea had helped orchestrate the raid, apparently believed Shea was trying to get Spawn to evict the family from the ranch. Manson may have considered it sinful that Shea, a white man, had married a black woman. Furthermore, Shea might have known about the Tate LaBianca killings. In separate trials, family members Bruce Davis and Steve Clem Grogan were also found guilty of Shea's murder. In 1977, authorities learned the exact location of Shorty Shea's remains and discovered that, contrary to family claims, Shea had not been dismembered and buried in multiple locations. Steve Grogan contacted the prosecutor and revealed that Shea's corpse had been buried intact. Grogan drew a map pinpointing the location, and the body was recovered. Of those convicted of Manson-ordered murders, Grogan became the first to be paroled in 1985. In total, Manson and his followers were convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder. However, the LAPD believes the family could have claimed at least 12 additional victims. Former LAPD Robbery Homicide Division Detective Cliff Shepard said, Manson repeatedly claimed to have killed many others. Prosecutor Stephen Kay supported this assertion, stating, "I know that Manson once told one of his cellmates he was responsible for 35 murders." Tate's younger sister, Deborah Tate, has claimed investigators are just scraping the surface regarding the number of Manson's victims, and elaborated on how Manson sent her a taunting map of the Panamint Range marked with crosses she believed represented buried bodies. This has resulted in several excavations at Manson's Barker Ranch, though no bodies have been found. At trial and in later bestsellers, prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi argued the murders were intended to promote a race war called Helter Skelter. Others argue the murders were simply attempts to free family member Bobby Beausoleil, who had been arrested for Gary Hinman's murder, by creating copycat crimes to convince authorities that Hinman's real killers remained at large. Still others suggest simpler motives, that the murders involved drugs or intimidation of Terry Melcher. In November 1968, the family had established headquarters in Death Valley at the Myers and Barker ranches. The former was owned by family member Catherine Gillies' grandmother. According to Charles Watson and Paul Watkins, Manson and Watson visited an acquaintance who played the Beatles' double album, and Manson became obsessed with the group. Watkins claimed Manson had been predicting that racial tensions between blacks and whites were about to erupt, that Black Americans would rise in rebellion, and that the Beatles' songs foretold it all in code. According to Watkins, by February the family would create an album whose songs would trigger the predicted chaos. Murders of whites by blacks would provoke retaliation. A split between racist and non-racist whites would result in white self-destruction. According to family members, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, Bobby Beausoleil, and others, Beausoleil's arrest for Gary Hinman's torture and murder catalyzed the family's subsequent murder spree. They wanted to convince police that Hinman's killer, or killers, remained at large. Truman Capote's interviews with Beausoleil and those by Anne Louise Bardock in November 1981 affirmed this account. Charlie Gwenter, a police detective who investigated the murders, said of Beausoleil, he called the Spawn Ranch after his arrest. The sole motive for those murders was to get Bobby out of jail. Bugliosi's co-prosecutor Aaron Stovitz said he believed the Tate LaBianca murders were copycat killings following Hinman's death. Other people suggested the motive related to drug dealing by Jay Sebring and Wojtek Frykowski, their connection with Charles Watson and Manson, and a bad drug transaction. For instance, Sebring's protege Jim Markham believes the murders responded to a bad drug deal the day before, in which Manson went to Tate's house to sell marijuana and cocaine to Sebring and Frykowski. Instead, the two men attacked and beat Manson. In a police interview, Frykowski's friend Witold Katsanowski said Frykowski had been involved with many criminals and drug trafficking. In his later interview with Truman Capote, Bobby Beausoleil said, "They burned people on dope deals." Sharon Tate and that gang. Ed Sanders and Paul Krasner uncovered information that Joel Rostow, boyfriend of Sebring's receptionist, had delivered mescaline and cocaine to Sebring and Frykowski at Tate's house hours before the murders. During the Manson trial, Rostow and other Sebring associates were murdered. In 1968, musician Dennis Wilson introduced record producer Terry Melcher to Manson. For a time, Melcher showed interest in recording Manson's music and making a film about the family and their hippie commune existence. Manson met Melcher at 1050 Cielo Drive, a house Melcher shared with his girlfriend, actress Candice Bergen, and musician Mark Lindsay. Manson eventually auditioned for Melcher, but Melcher declined to sign him. There was continued discussion about a documentary featuring Manson's music, but Melcher abandoned the project after witnessing Manson fighting with a drunken stuntman at Spawn Ranch. Wilson and Melcher severed their ties with Manson, angering him. Soon after, Melcher and Bergen moved out of the Cielo Drive home. The house's owner, Rudy Altobelli, then leased it to film director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate. Manson reportedly visited the house on multiple occasions asking for Melcher, but was told Melcher had moved. Some authors and law enforcement personnel have theorized that Manson targeted the Cielo Drive house as revenge for Melcher's rejection, unaware that he and Bergen had moved out. However, family member Charles Tex Watson stated that Manson and company did know Melcher no longer lived there, and Melcher's former roommate Mark Lindsay stated, "Terry and I talked about it later," and Terry said, "Manson knew Melcher had moved because Manson or someone from his organization left a note on Terry's porch in Malibu." The Manson murders reportedly prompted Melcher to go into seclusion. When Manson was arrested, it was widely reported he had sent his followers to the house to kill Melcher and Bergen. Manson family member Susan Atkins, who admitted her role in the murders, told police and a grand jury that the house was chosen to instill fear into Terry Melcher because Terry had given us his word on a few things and never came through with them. Melcher employed a bodyguard and told Manson prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi his fear was so great he had undergone psychiatric treatment. Melcher was described as the most frightened witness at trial, even though Bugliosi assured him, "Manson knew you were no longer living on Cielo Drive." In his 2019 book, Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, Tom O'Neill re-examined the Manson case and found evidence that Melcher may have been more closely involved with the Manson family than he admitted at trial. Reviewing police files and other data, O'Neill found evidence Melcher was associating with Manson during the 4-month period after the Tate LaBianca murders, but before Manson's arrest. These documents, seemingly hidden by Bugliosi, undermine claims that the Tate murders were intended to frighten Melcher in revenge for his refusal to record Manson's music. O'Neill also found documents indicating Melcher was having sex with 15-year-old Manson family member Ruth Ann Morehouse. Dean Morehouse, Ruth Ann's father and a Manson family member, had also resided at 1050 Cielo Drive with Melcher. Tex Watson frequently visited the residence as well. The Tate murders became national news on August 9, 1969. The Polanski's housekeeper, Winifred Chapman, discovered the murder scene when she arrived for work that morning. On August 10, detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction in the Hinman case, informed LAPD detectives assigned to the Tate case about the bloody writing at the Hinman house. According to Vincent Bugliosi, because detectives believed the Tate murders resulted from a drug transaction, the Tate team initially ignored this and other evidence of similarities between the crimes. The Tate autopsies were underway before the LaBianca bodies were discovered. During the Tate autopsies, detectives working the Gary Hinman case noticed similarities in weapons used, stab wounds, and blood writing on walls. They also suspected the case involved narcotics and brought this information to detectives working the Tate murders. According to Detective Charlie Gwenther, Vince Bugliosi didn't want anything to do with the Hinman case. Hinman was a nothing case. Vince didn't want to prosecute it. Stephen Parrott, fatally shot in the Tate Polanski driveway, was found to be an acquaintance of William Garretson, the caretaker who lived in the guest house. Garretson had been hired by Rudy Altobelli to maintain the property during Altobelli's absence. The killers encountered Parrott as he was leaving after visiting Garretson. Briefly held as a Tate suspect, Garretson told police he had neither seen nor heard anything on the murder night. He was released on August 11, 1969, after a polygraph examination indicated he had not been involved in the crimes. The LaBianca crime scene was discovered on August 10th, hours after the murders were committed. 15-year-old Frank Struthers, Rosemary's son from a previous marriage and Leno's stepson, returned from a camping trip and was concerned to see all the window shades drawn and his stepfather's speedboat still attached to the family car parked in the driveway. He called his older sister and her boyfriend. The boyfriend, Joe Dorgan, accompanied young Struthers into the house, where they discovered Leno's body. They called police, who found Rosemary's body after officers arrived. On August 12, 1969, the LAPD told the press it had ruled out any connection between the Tate and LaBianca homicides. On August 16, the sheriff's office raided Spawn Ranch and arrested Manson and others as suspects in a major auto theft ring that had been stealing Volkswagen Beetles and converting them into dune buggies. Weapons were seized, but because the search warrant had been misdated, the group was released days later. In a report at August's end, LaBianca detectives noted a possible connection between the bloody writings at the LaBianca house and the singing group, the Beatles' most recent album. Still working separately from the Tate team, the LaBianca team checked with the sheriff's office in mid-October about possible similar crimes. They learned of the Hinman case and discovered that Hinman detectives had spoken with Beausoleil's girlfriend, Kitty Lutzinger. She had been arrested days earlier with members of the Manson family. The arrests for car thefts had occurred at desert ranches where the family had relocated. Unknown to authorities, members had been searching Death Valley for a hole in the ground they believed was access to the bottomless pit. A joint force of National Park Service rangers and officers from the California Highway Patrol and Inyo County Sheriff's Office, federal, state, and county personnel, had raided both Myers and Barker ranches after following evidence left when family members burned an earth mover owned by Death Valley National Monument. The raiders found stolen dune buggies and other vehicles and arrested 24 people, including Manson. A highway patrol officer found Manson hiding in a cabinet beneath Barker's bathroom sink. The officers had no idea the people they were arresting were involved with Los Angeles murders. Following up leads a month after speaking with Lutzinger. LaBianca detectives contacted members of a motorcycle gang Manson had tried recruiting as bodyguards while the family was at Spawn Ranch. While gang members were providing information suggesting a link between Manson and the Tate LaBianca murders, a dormitory mate of Susan Atkins informed LAPD of the family's involvement in the crimes. Atkins was booked for the Hinman murder after telling sheriff's detectives she had been involved. Transferred to Sybil Brand Institute, a detention center in Monterey Park, California, she began talking to bunkmates, Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham, giving them accounts of events in which she had participated. On December 3, 1969, acting on information from these sources, LAPD announced warrants for Watson, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian's arrest in the Tate case. The suspects' involvement in the LaBianca murders was noted. Manson and Atkins, already in custody, were not mentioned. The connection between the LaBianca case and Van Houten, who was among those arrested near Death Valley, had not yet been recognized. Watson and Krenwinkel were already under arrest, with authorities in McKinney, Texas, and Mobile, Alabama having picked them up on LAPD's notice. Informed that a warrant was out for her arrest, Kasabian voluntarily surrendered to authorities in Concord, New Hampshire on December 27. Soon, physical evidence such as Krenwinkel's and Watson's fingerprints, collected by LAPD at Cielo Drive, was augmented by evidence recovered by the public. On September 8, 1969, the distinctive .22 caliber high-standard buntline special revolver Watson used on Parent, Sebring, and Frykowski had been found and given to police by Stephen Weiss, a 10-year-old who lived near the Tate residence. In mid-December, when the Los Angeles Times published a crime account based on information Susan Atkins had given her attorney, Weiss's father made several phone calls that finally prompted LAPD to locate the gun in its evidence file and connect it with the murders through ballistics tests. Acting on that same newspaper account, a local ABC television crew quickly located and recovered the bloody clothing discarded by the Tate killers. The knives discarded en route from the Tate residence were never recovered, despite searches by some of the same crewmen and months later by LAPD. A knife found behind a chair cushion in the Tate living room was apparently Susan Atkins, who lost her knife during the attack. The trial began June 15, 1970. The prosecution's main witness was Kasabian, who along with Manson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel had been charged with 7 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Since Kasabian had not participated in the killings by all accounts, she was granted immunity in exchange for testimony detailing the nights of the crimes. Originally, a deal had been made with Atkins, in which the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty against her in exchange for her grand jury testimony, on which the indictments were secured. Once Atkins repudiated that testimony, the deal was withdrawn. Because Van Houten had participated only in the LaBianca killings, she was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Originally, Judge William Keene had reluctantly granted Manson permission to act as his own attorney. Because of Manson's conduct, including violations of a gag order and submission of outlandish and nonsensical pre-trial motions, the permission was withdrawn before the trial's start. Manson filed an affidavit of prejudice against Keene, who was replaced by Judge Charles Older. On Friday, July 24, the first day of testimony, Manson appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead. He issued a statement that he was considered inadequate and incompetent to speak or defend himself, and had X'd himself from the establishment's world. Over the following weekend, the female defendants duplicated the mark on their own foreheads, as did most family members within a day or so. The prosecution argued that triggering the helter-skelter scenario was Manson's main motive. Present at the crime scene were the words, "pigs" and "helter-skelter," written in blood by Susan Atkins, referencing the Beatles' song Helter Skelter from their 1968 album. These messages correlated with testimony about Manson's predictions that black people would murder white people and write similar warnings in blood at the outset of Helter Skelter. The defendants testified that the wall writing was meant to imitate the Hinman murder scene, not signal an apocalyptic race war. According to Bugliosi, Manson directed Kasabian to hide a wallet taken from the scene in the women's restroom of a service station near a black neighborhood. However, as co-prosecutor Stephen Kay later pointed out, the wallet was actually left miles away in the predominantly white neighborhood of Sylmar. During the trial, family members loitered near the courthouse entrances and corridors. To keep them out of the courtroom proper, the prosecution subpoenaed them as prospective witnesses, preventing their entry while others were testifying. When the group established a sidewalk vigil, some members wore sheathed hunting knives that, though in plain view, were carried legally. Each was also identifiable by the X on their forehead. Some family members attempted to dissuade witnesses from testifying. Prosecution witnesses Paul Watkins and Juan Flynn were both threatened. Watkins was badly burned in a suspicious fire in his van. Former family member Barbara Hoyt, who had overheard Susan Atkins describing the Tate murders to family member Ruth Ann Morehouse, agreed to accompany the latter to Hawaii. There, Morehouse allegedly gave her a hamburger spiked with several doses of LSD. Found sprawled on a Honolulu curb in a drugged semi-stupor, Hoyt was taken to the hospital, where she identified herself as a witness in the Tate LaBianca murder trial. Before the incident, Hoyt had been a reluctant witness. After the attempt to silence her, her reticence disappeared. On August 4, despite court precautions, Manson flashed the jury a Los Angeles Times front page with the headline, "Manson Guilty, Nixon Declares." This referenced a statement made the previous day when U.S. President Richard Nixon had decried what he saw as the media's glamorization of Manson. When questioned by Judge Charles Older, the jurors claimed the headline had not influenced them. The next day, the female defendant stood up and said in unison that, in light of Nixon's remark, there was no point in continuing with the trial. On October 5th, Manson was denied the court's permission to question a prosecution witness whom defense attorneys had declined to cross-examine. Leaping over the defense table, Manson attempted to attack the judge. Wrestled to the ground by bailiffs, he was removed from the courtroom along with the female defendants, who had subsequently risen and begun chanting in Latin. Thereafter, Older allegedly began wearing a revolver under his robes. On November 16, the prosecution rested its case. 3 days later, after arguing standard dismissal motions, the defense stunned the court by resting as well without calling a single witness. Shouting their disapproval, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten demanded their right to testify. In chambers, the women's lawyers told the judge their clients wanted to testify that they had planned and committed the crimes, and that Manson had not been involved. By resting their case, the defense lawyers had tried to prevent this. Van Houten's attorney, Ronald Hughes, vehemently stated he would not push a client out the window. In the prosecutor's view, it was Manson who was advising the women to testify this way as a means of saving himself. Speaking about the trial in a 1987 documentary, Krenwinkel said, "The entire proceedings were scripted by Charlie." The next day, Manson testified with the jury removed from the courtroom. According to Vincent Bugliosi, this was to ensure Manson's address did not violate the California Supreme Court's decision in People v. Aranda by making statements implicating his co-defendants. However, Bugliosi argued, Manson would use his hypnotic powers to unfairly influence the jury. Speaking for more than an hour, Manson said, among other things, that the music is telling the youth to rise up against the establishment. He said, "Why blame it on me? I didn't write the music." Manson also stated, "To be honest with you, I don't recall ever saying, 'Get a knife and a change of clothes and go do what Tex says.'" As the trial's body concluded and closing arguments approached, defense attorney Hughes disappeared during a weekend trip. When Maxwell Keith was appointed to represent Van Houten in Hughes's absence, a delay of more than 2 weeks was required to permit Keith to familiarize himself with the voluminous trial transcripts. No sooner had the trial resumed, just before Christmas, than disruptions of the prosecution's closing argument by the defendants led Older to ban the four defendants from the courtroom for the remainder of the guilt phase. This may have occurred because the defendants were acting in collusion with each other and simply putting on a performance, which Older said was becoming obvious. On January 25, 1971, the jury returned guilty verdicts against the four defendants on each of the separate counts against them. Not far into the trial's penalty phase, the jurors finally saw the defense that Manson, in the prosecution's view, had planned to present. Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten testified the murders had been conceived as copycat versions of the Hinman murder, for which Atkins now took credit. The killings, they said, were intended to draw suspicion away from Bobby Beausoleil by resembling the crime for which he had been jailed. This plan had supposedly been the work of, and carried out under the guidance of, not Manson, but someone allegedly in love with Beausoleil, Linda Kasabian. Among the narrative's weak points was Atkins' inability to explain why, as she was maintaining, she had written "political piggy" at the Hinman house in the first place. Midway through the penalty phase, Manson shaved his head and trimmed his beard to a fork. He told the press, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." In what the prosecution regarded as belated recognition on their part that imitating Manson only proved his domination, the female defendants refrained from shaving their heads until the jurors retired to weigh the state's request for the death penalty. The effort to exonerate Manson via the copycat scenario failed. On March 29, 1971, the jury returned death verdicts against all four defendants on all counts. On April 19, 1971, Judge Older sentenced the four to death. Watson returned to McKinney, Texas after the Tate LaBianca murders. He was arrested in Texas on November 30, 1969, after local police were notified by California investigators that his fingerprints matched a print found on the front door of the Tate home. Watson fought extradition to California long enough that he was not included among the three defendants tried with Manson. His trial commenced in August 1971. By October, he too had been found guilty on 7 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Unlike the others, Watson presented a psychiatric defense. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi made short work of Watson's insanity claims. Like his co-conspirators, Watson was sentenced to death. In February 1972, the death sentences of all 5 parties were automatically reduced to life in prison by People v. Anderson, in which the California Supreme Court abolished the death penalty in that state. After his return to prison, Manson's rhetoric and hippie speeches held little sway. Though he found temporary acceptance from the Aryan Brotherhood, his role was submissive to a sexually aggressive member of the group at San Quentin. Before the conclusion of Manson's Tate LaBianca trial, a Los Angeles Times reporter tracked down Manson's mother, remarried and living in the Pacific Northwest. The former Kathleen Maddox claimed that in childhood, her son had suffered no neglect. He had even been pampered by all the women who surrounded him. On September 5, 1975, the family returned to national attention when Squeaky Fromme attempted to assassinate U.S. President Gerald Ford. The attempt took place in Sacramento, where she and fellow Manson follower Sandra Good had moved to be near Manson while he was incarcerated at Folsom State Prison. A subsequent search of the apartment shared by Fromme, Good, and another family recruit turned up evidence that, coupled with later actions by Good, resulted in Good's conviction for conspiring to send threatening communications through the United States Mail Service and for transmitting death threats by way of interstate commerce. The threats involved corporate executives and U.S. government officials regarding supposed environmental dereliction on their part. Fromme was sentenced to life in prison, becoming the first person sentenced under United States Code Title 18, which made it a federal crime to attempt to assassinate the President of the United States. In December 1987, Fromme, serving a life sentence for the assassination attempt, escaped briefly from federal prison camp Alderson in West Virginia. She was trying to reach Manson because she heard he had testicular cancer. She was apprehended within days. She was released on parole from Federal Medical Center Carswell on August 14, 2009. Steve Clem. Grogan was paroled in 1985. In a 1994 conversation with Manson prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, Catherine Scher, a one-time Manson follower, stated that her testimony in the penalty phase of Manson's trial had been a fabrication intended to save Manson from the gas chamber and had been given under Manson's explicit direction. Scher's testimony had introduced the copycat motive story, which the testimony of the three female defendants echoed, and according to which the Tate LaBianca murders had been Linda Kasabian's idea. In a 1997 segment of the tabloid television program Hard Copy, Scher implied her testimony had been given under a Manson threat of physical harm. In August 1971, after Manson's trial and sentencing, Scher had participated in a violent California retail store robbery, the object of which was acquiring weapons to help free Manson. In January 1996, a Manson website was established by Latter-day Manson follower George Stimson, who was helped by Sandra Good. Good had been released from prison in 1985 after serving 10 years of her 15-year sentence for the death threats. In a 1998-1999 interview in Seconds magazine, Bobby Beausoleil rejected the view that Manson ordered him to kill Gary Hinman. He stated that Manson did come to Hinman's house and slash Hinman with a sword, which he had previously denied in a 1981 interview with We magazine. Beausoleil stated that when he read about the Tate murders in the newspaper, "I wasn't even sure at that point. Really, I had no idea who had done it until Manson's group were actually arrested for it. It had only crossed my mind, and I had a premonition perhaps. There was some little tickle in my mind that the killings might be connected with them." In the We magazine interview, he had stated, "When the Tate LaBianca murders happened, I knew who had done it. I was fairly certain." William Garretson, once the young caretaker at 150 Cielo Drive, indicated in a program called The Last Days of Sharon Tate, broadcast on July 25, 1999 on E!, that he had in fact seen and heard a portion of the Tate murders from his location in the property's guest house. This corroborated the unofficial results of the polygraph examination given to Garretson on August 10, 1969, that had effectively eliminated him as a suspect. The LAPD officer who conducted the examination had concluded Garretson was clean on participation in the crimes, but muddy as to his having heard anything. It was announced in early 2008 that Susan Atkins was suffering from brain cancer. An application for compassionate release, based on her health status, was denied in July 2008, and she was denied parole for the 18th and final time on September 2, 2009. Atkins died of natural causes days later on September 24, 2009, at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. In a January 2008 segment of the Discovery Channel's Most Evil, Barbara Hoyt said that the impression that she had accompanied Ruth Ann Morehouse to Hawaii just to avoid testifying at Manson's trial was erroneous. Hoyt said she had cooperated with the family because she was trying to keep them from killing my family. She stated that at the time of the trial, she was constantly being threatened, "Your family's gonna die. The murders could be repeated at your house." On March 15, 2008, the Associated Press reported that forensic investigators had conducted a search for human remains at Barker Ranch the previous month. Following up on long-standing rumors that the family had killed hitchhikers and runaways who had come into its orbit during its time at Barker, the investigators identified 2 likely clandestine grave sites and 1 additional site that merits further investigation. Though they recommended digging, CNN reported that the Inyo County Sheriff, who questioned the methods they employed with search dogs, had ordered additional tests before any excavation. On May 9, after a delay caused by damage to test equipment, the sheriff announced that test results had been inconclusive and that exploratory excavation would begin on May 20. In the meantime, Charles Tex Watson had commented publicly that no one was killed. At the desert camp during the month and a half, he was there after the Tate LaBianca murders. On May 21st, after 2 days of work, the sheriff brought the search to an end. 4 potential grave sites had been dug up and had been found to hold no human remains. In September 2009, the History Channel broadcast a docudrama covering the family's activities and the murders as part of its coverage on the 40th anniversary of the killings. The program included an in-depth interview with Linda Kasabian, who spoke publicly for the first time since the 1989 appearance on A Current Affair, an American television news magazine. Also included in the History Channel program were interviews with Vincent Bugliosi, Catherine Scher, and Deborah Tate, Sharon's sister. As the 40th anniversary of the Tate-LaBianca murders approached, in July 2009, Los Angeles Magazine published an oral history in which former family members, law enforcement officers, and others involved with Manson, the arrests, and the trials offered their recollections of and observations on the events that made Manson notorious. In the article, Juan Flynn, a Spawn Ranch worker who had become associated with Manson and the family, said, "Charles Manson got away with everything. People will say, he's in jail. But Charlie is exactly where he wants to be." Charles Manson died of a heart attack and complications from colon cancer on November 19, 2017. He was 83 years old. Bobby Beausoleil was recommended for parole by the California Board of Parole in 2009 at his 19th hearing, but California Governor Gavin Newsom denied parole. Leslie Van Houten was released on parole on July 11, 2023, at the age of 73.